Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered Podcast, we're covering the insane case of the Amato family murders. I feel like I haven't talked to y'all in so long, it even feels weird being in the she shed. I don't know, I've been trying to do better at managing my time. I don't know how I'm the adult in this situation, but here we are. So this case is pretty well known, and it has been covered by quite a few other podcasters, YouTube channels, but it's just because this case is that crazy. This is kind of one of those cases that'll stay with you if this is the first time you're hearing it, and if not, you'll immediately know which case I'm talking about. And this is also going to be a two-part series, so with all that being said, and without further ado, let's get it. Grant Amato was born to his parents, Chad and Margaret Amato, on May 20th in 1989 in Florida. Grant was the youngest of Chad and Margaret's kids together, but Margaret did have a son named Jason from a previous relationship when she and Chad first got together. But Chad did eventually go on to adopt Jason, so that ended up working out perfectly. So at the beginning of their relationship, Chad and Margaret only had Jason, but the couple would eventually go on to have another son who they would name Cody. And then 2 years after Cody was born, they welcomed Grant. So altogether, the couple had 3 boys, Jason, Cody, and Grant. And from all accounts, Chad and Margaret had always been able to provide a really good, stable home life for all of their kids. Both Chad and Margaret always had steady, well-respected, well-paying jobs, and their kids never wanted for anything. Chad worked as a pharmacist while Margaret worked her way up the transcriptor ladder until she was able to work from home in her managerial role. And while the boys never wanted for anything, Jason, who was the oldest of the Amato kids, does later recall that his dad was strict on them as they got older, and that Chad held all 3 of his sons to pretty high expectations, which I feel like most parents do hold their kids to pretty high expectations, just because we know as their parents what our kids are capable of. And we want to push them, of course, to be the best versions of themselves. And obviously, Chad was no different. And while Jason said that Chad could be tough on all the kids, that he was never abusive and that he had never been violent. But obviously, as the 3 Amato boys got older and into their teenage years, the expectations that Chad had held them to kind of ended up becoming a point of contention throughout the family dynamic, which I also think is pretty normal. Teenagers know absolutely everything and nothing at all at the same time. So I can definitely see how this would happen. Jason also later recalled that his dad, Chad, was very particular, he was the kind of person where everything had its own place, and it should be kept there. He was very well organized, which I am not. Chad had actually built the Amato family home on roughly 3.5 acres of property, while Jason, Cody, and Grant all had their own bedrooms inside the family house. They also had things like a game room and plenty of things to do outside to keep themselves busy. And even with the high expectations and the contention that was sometimes raised throughout the Amato house, as Grant and his older brother Cody got older and into high school, they were essentially best friends. They were on the same weightlifting team together, and they ran in the same social circles. So by the time that Cody and Grant were in high school together, Jason was old enough that he had finished high school and he had already moved out of the family house. But Cody and Grant, on the other hand, they were so close that they decided that they would both go together to the same nursing school and go to the same nursing program, which they did eventually do after high school. They did both attend nursing school together at the University of Central Florida, and once they finished nursing school, Cody and Grant had both decided to take their education even further and take programs in anesthesiology, which they also did together. Now, Cody ended up finishing and graduating his classes for anesthesiology nursing, but Grant, on the other hand, dropped out before he completed all the necessary courses, which is kind of where the brothers' plans started to fall apart. Because Cody and Grant hadn't just planned to go to college together, they'd also planned to get their degrees together and then buy themselves matching BMWs, and they had even had plans to buy their parents' house in Florida after their parents had retired and moved to Tennessee to a house that they had purchased strictly for retirement. So Grant and Cody had plans to buy their parents' house, and their parents had plans to sell them the house and move to Tennessee to their retirement property. And for a while, the plans that Grant and Cody had made together were going exactly as they'd hoped. Grant graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Nursing in 2011, and afterwards, Grant and Cody both enrolled in the same, anesthesiology program for nursing. They even sat next to each other in these classes. But it was after they enrolled in these classes that Grant failed out of the program, which in turn left Cody to finish the program on his own. And it's a little unclear to me on whether Grant failed out of the anesthesiology program or if he was kicked out or, what happened. But whatever the case may be, this would kind of become the milestone marker for where things took a horrible turn for the worse for Grant. But we'll get there. So after Cody finished the program, he was able to land a job at a local hospital as an anesthesiology nurse, and he was making pretty decent money. Now, even though Grant hadn't finished the anesthesiology program, he did finish nursing school, so he was able to land a job as a nurse at a local hospital, where he was employed there for about 5 years. After those 5 years, though, Grant was eventually fired from this job as a nurse at the local hospital in June of 2018, and he was fired due to the accusation that he had been stealing different types of medication and not using them correctly. We'll just say that. And the hospital did file charges against Grant, but his brother and best friend Cody just couldn't sit idly by and not do anything. So Cody actually ended up paying roughly $8,000 for a lawyer to represent Grant on these charges, and that eventually led to those charges against Grant being dropped by the hospital. But because this arrest was still technically on Grant's criminal record, that made it virtually impossible to land another job in the nursing field. And instead of Grant just trying to find a different job in any other field of work, he instead just stayed in his room on his computer at his parents' house all day long, hoping to become a big shot, hot shot streamer on the Twitch app. And for anybody who doesn't know what Twitch is, because same, I had to look it up. First of all, it's a free app, and the app is a live streaming platform where every user can communicate and interact with one another. So instead of going to his local grocery store or warehouse to apply for a job, Grant just figured it would be his best bet to try to make it big as a, Twitch streamer. But Grant's parents were starting to kind of worry about him. He was spending all of his time on the computer either gaming or live streaming on Twitch. And then all this time on the computer led Grant to stumble upon a website for cam girls. And when I tell you after reading into this case, if y'all see me on a cam girl website making bank, no you didn't, mind your business. Because the amount of money that Grant spent on these cam girls was astronomical. Astronomical. So if you see me on a cam girl website, mind your business. Okay. Because I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, let's go back. So Grant stumbles upon this website for cam girls, and he starts chatting with this Bulgarian model who is a woman who went by the name of Sylvie. And for Grant, it was a love at first sight. He was immediately entranced with Sylvie, and he fell in love almost instantly. But cam girls cost money, and Grant doesn't have a job at this point. So, where's he coming up with the money for these cam girls? Well, Grant was bumming, begging, and borrowing and stealing money from everyone in his immediate family. Grant would ask his brother, Cody, to borrow money to help advertise his Twitch account so that he could kind of get his name out there and, accumulate a larger audience. And Cody would usually give it to him because while being a Twitch streamer may not be the most conventional way to make money, it can definitely be done. It's almost like having a large following on YouTube where eventually enough money, you can make enough money for it to be considered your job. And Twitch is basically the same way. It's it may not be easy, but it is definitely doable. So Grant was always asking his parents for money for advertising his Twitch account, and if they wouldn't give it to him, then he would just take it anyways. Grant's parents, Chad and Margaret, started noticing charges on their credit and debit cards for websites that they had never even heard of. So eventually, Chad and Margaret confronted Grant, and you'll be surprised to learn that Grant actually fessed up to being the one that was making those charges on their account. But Grant also made his parents believe that he had used that money to promote himself on Twitch, maybe like paying for advertisement or, running advertisements, email list, what have you. But you've probably already guessed that Grant wasn't actually using any of that money to upstart his Twitch career. Instead, he was spending thousands and thousands of dollars on live chats and performances with the cam girl that he'd fallen in love with, who was Sylvie. Grant was spending an ungodly amount of time and money on Sylvie's website, because the way that it was set up to work is that you would go to Sylvie's cam girl page and you could buy tokens. And these tokens could be used for live performances, private chats, like video calls. You could leave her tips with these tokens, etc. But Sylvie wasn't cheap. Her performances costed 90 tokens per minute. Grant was spending about $600 a day on just tokens. Now, for $600 a day, Grant was getting 5,000 tokens to use for whatever he wanted with Sylvie. And Grant was sometimes spending as much as 4 hours a day on Sylvie's website, which, let's just kind of do a little bit of math. I'm not good at it, but we're going to try. So for $600, Grant was getting 5,000 tokens. And at 90 tokens per minute, that's only 55 and a half minutes. And if Grant was spending upwards of 3 and 4 hours a day on Sylvie's website, that would mean that those days when Grant was spending 4 hours on Sylvie's website, that it would have costed him about $2,400 in order to buy enough tokens to even last him for 4 hours. And again, let me say this in case you forgot, Grant doesn't have a job. And Grant was really playing up this fantasy world that he was telling Sylvie that he lived in. Because Grant was telling Sylvie that he was loaded. He drove this BMW just like he and Cody had planned, but it never happened. And that's kind of the beauty of the internet. You can literally be anyone that you want to be. And for Grant, in this imaginary world that he lived in online with Sylvie, he was rich, he was successful, and the two of them were just madly in love. Sylvie felt the same way about Grant as he felt about her in his imaginary world. And Grant would try to keep this charade up of being wealthy and well off with Sylvie by doing things like leaving her outrageously expensive tips and even sending her different sex toys and different pieces of lingerie so that she could use and wear these things during the performances that he was paying for using these tokens that he'd bought. And it seems like what Grant was doing was asking his parents or his brother for their credit cards to promote and advertise his Twitch account. But once Grant had access to those credit cards, he would use them and then max them out on tokens to see and talk to Sylvie on this webcam site. And then once he maxed all those credit cards out, he would go to them and ask them for a different credit card to use to promote and advertise his Twitch account. And Grant's family seemed to be the kind of family that they were like overly supportive. And almost so that it turned into like an enabling habit. And that's exactly what happened. I feel like it's important to say that Grant wasn't just seeing and talking to Sylvie during these chats and performances though, because Grant and Sylvie would also like text one another and keep in touch outside of this website. Which I guess this made it feel more like a relationship for Grant, but keep in mind that's literally a whole part of the cam girl's job. They give the illusion that they're into you and that you're special to them, and that's how they make their money. But Grant didn't seem to grasp that concept, because in Grant's mind, he was in love with Sylvie and she was just as in love with him. In Grant's mind, Sylvie was his and his alone, and for that reason, he kept doing whatever it took to be able to see Sylvie, and it didn't matter, how much he had to steal in order to do that. But eventually, Grant's parents and his brother started looking into these different charges on their credit card statements, and that's actually how Grant's parents and his brother found out that they had been, that he had been using their credit cards on a camgirl website and not actually promoting anything for his Twitch account. But being found out wasn't going to stop Grant from stealing and taking any money that he could in order to buy tokens so that he could keep in touch with his beloved Sylvie. Grant still continuously stole money from his parents and his brother, and he got so desperate at one point that when he couldn't find their cash or cards, that Grant even stole guns from his brother Cody and sold Cody's guns for money so that he could purchase these tokens to be able to chat with Sylvie. And I'm still not sure how Grant pulled this next part off, but somehow Grant was even able to take out a loan for $65,000 using his parents' house as collateral. His parents had no idea that there was even a loan taken out on their house. So again, I'm not sure how he managed to do that. Grant himself says during a police interview that he'd probably stolen around $200,000 from his parents and his brother Cody. And it was at this point when the truth was finally revealed about actually how much money Grant had stolen. His family decided that it was time to do like an intervention type of meeting with him. And it was during this intervention that Grant finally broke down and admitted to his family that he hadn't actually been stealing money from them to advertise for himself on Twitch. But surprisingly, he instead just told his family the truth, that he had been stealing money from them so that he could send it to the Bulgarian cam girl that he had fallen completely in love with. And let me just say this, Grant's family did see this for what it was. They saw that Grant was struggling with some kind of addiction to either porn or Sylvie herself. And between the money that he was, spending on Sylvie, the cam girls, and thinking that Sylvie was actually in love with him too, they did see this as an addiction. And they were super supportive and even understanding. But after this admission of guilt, Grant's brother Cody and their dad Chad, they did become more strict with their finances, and they refused to give Grant any money at all. But they weren't doing this to be malicious, they were trying to help. So Grant and Cody had both always planned to go see Japan together. And this planned trip to Japan was obviously made before Grant was fired from the hospital for stealing meds. But after the little family intervention, Cody brought up the trip to Japan that he and Grant never got to take, and Cody came up with the idea that might just help Grant get his mind off of Sylvie. So Cody told Grant to pack his bags. They were going to Japan, and they were going with one of their closest friends, Jericho. So Grant, Cody, and their buddy Jericho all head out for a 10-day trip to Japan in December of 2018. And this wasn't just like a spur-of-the-moment trip. Grant and his brother Cody had been planning this trip for a long time, but it was before Grant lost his job. This trip was in sort of the same plans as the brothers driving matching BMWs and buying their parents' house after they retired. But after Grant lost his job, the trip was just kind of put on hold. So with the family confronting Grant about all the stolen money, Cody figured that this would be the perfect time to get Grant out of the house and for them to go ahead and take this long-awaited trip to Japan together. Now, obviously, Grant didn't have any money, so Cody was the one who was going to pay for everything that Grant needed or wanted on this trip to Japan. Cody paid for Grant's travel expenses, his room, his food, any attractions they went to, or trinkets or souvenirs that they got while they were there. Cody paid for it all. And this trip seemed to be exactly what Grant needed to get his mind off of things. Because he hadn't even so much as spoken one word about Sylvie during this 10-day trip. And then on the very last day of the trip, Cody jumped in the shower and Grant told his buddy Jericho that he was going to walk down to the lobby and just grab something to eat. But when Cody got out of the shower and noticed that Grant wasn't in the room, he immediately knew that Grant had left to find a place where he could go chat with Sylvie. He just knew it. Cody had been keeping Grant pretty close to him throughout this whole trip so that he wouldn't have a chance to talk with Sylvie. And lo and behold, Cody did end up finding Grant at a casino type of building using their Wi-Fi to buy tokens on Sylvie's camgirl site. So Cody had been right, he had snuck off to find a way to talk to Sylvie. But it seems like no one really thought in that moment to ask where Grant had gotten the money to buy the tokens to be able to even chat with Sylvie. Because it wasn't until later on that evening, after Cody, Grant, and Jericho had gotten back to the U.S. from their trip to Japan, that Jericho tried to pay for his dinner, and he learned that his cards had been locked. When Jericho looked further into his banking history, he learned that there had been 3 charges on a camgirl website for tokens. Luckily, Jericho's bank had only let one of the 3 charges go through, and then the bank had denied the other 2 charges and marked them as suspicious. So while they had been on this trip to Japan, Grant had somehow written down, Jericho's credit card numbers and then used it later on when he snuck off to buy tokens so that he could talk to Sylvie on her camgirl site. And it was only a few days after Grant, Cody, and their friend Jericho had returned from their trip to Japan that Grant and his dad Chad got into an argument about how Grant needed to get a job, any job, so that he could start repaying the money that he had stolen from everybody around him. Grant obviously did not want to hear this, so he left the house and did not say where he was going or what he was planning to do. And after a while of not seeing or hearing from Grant, Chad called the police to report his 29-year-old grown-ass son had essentially run away from home. And of course, his parents were worried about him after they hadn't heard from him for a while, but still, to call a very able-bodied 29-year-old man a runaway just sounds ridiculous to me. Grant's parents did explain to police that Grant had been depressed and that he had been going through some things, and Grant's parents were more so worried about Grant hurting himself, especially after Grant sent a text to his mom, Margaret, telling her that he was sick of everything and that he was just going to handle things in his own way. Which, to a worried parent, I'm sure that does sound like a self-harming threat. But in reality, though, Grant had only gone to stay with his Aunt Donna. But he was only there for a few days before Aunt Donna started seeing charges on her account that she hadn't made or approved. Donna obviously put two and two together and came to the realization that Grant had been stealing money from her accounts in just the few days that he had been staying with her. And Aunt Donna wasn't as forgiving as everybody else had been up to this point with Grant. Aunt Donna wanted to press charges against Grant because you can't be a grown-ass man and steal money from everybody around you with absolutely no consequences. But Grant's parents, Chad and Margaret, begged Donna not to press charges. And what actually ended up happening is that Grant's brother Cody ended up being the one who repaid the money to their Aunt Donna that Grant had stolen from her. So Cody's repaying Grant's theft, essentially. Grant had literally stolen from every single person in his life at this point, and it had gotten to be so much money that Grant's dad Chad ended up having to take out a second mortgage on their family home. And Chad had even told a few people that he wasn't going to be able to retire as early as he thought he was going to be able to, but he even said that he didn't mind working those few extra years as long as it would keep Grant out of jail. And I know this was coming from a place of love, but this is extreme enabling behavior. And let me just say that Grant really truly believed that Sylvie was just as into him as he was into her. Like, he didn't realize that this is her actual job. This is how she pays her bills. There are even videos online of Grant recording himself doing everyday mundane things, and he would send these to Sylvie. For example, in one video, Grant is recording himself walking to the mailbox to check the mail, and I actually want to play this video real quick. It's super short, but I do want to play it just so you can hear how delusional he actually is.
Alright, Sylvia, look at me. I'm outside going to check the mail. And I'm asking you if you can please, pretty please, send me one of your videos. I love it so much when you just send them to me. Yeah, I don't like buying your stuff. It makes me feel weird. Could you please send me one, though?
Delusional, right? Yeah. So, newsflash, y'all, she's probably only sending him like a short 3-second video when he hasn't bought tokens to see and chat with her for a while. She would obviously know how many tokens each one of her clients usually buy and how often. So it's likely that if she sees somebody who normally puts no dollar amount on how many tokens they buy, and then she sees that they haven't bought tokens in, let's say, a week, she might send them like a short 3 or 4 second video clip to remind them that she's still there to do performances and to chat with. Again, because this is her job. But Grant's crazy ass is like, she sends me 3-second video clips every once in a while because she's like so in love with me. And then at the end of the video, he says like, oh, I hate buying stuff from you. It makes me feel weird. Because bro, that's the only way you're going to see her is if you buy stuff from her. She's not in love with you. It's her literal job to make you feel special. But let's get back on track. So Cody paid off all the money that Grant had stolen from their Aunt Donna, and Chad realized that he's not going to get to retire as soon as he thought. And then this is when it becomes pretty clear that Grant was suffering from severe addiction to porn, and an even obsessive kind of addiction to Sylvie herself, the cam girl. So this is when Grant's family starts calling around to different recovery facilities to find one that had an opening for Grant and one that would take him in. And on September 23rd, 2018, Grant met with his mom, his dad, both of his brothers, and they all met up at their Aunt Donna's house, where they tried to do like another intervention type of family meeting with Grant. This time, Grant's brother Cody was kind of the talking head of the family during this intervention, and after some back and forth and some arguing, of course, Grant did eventually break down and agree to go to the Cornerstone Recovery Center, which is in Fort Lauderdale in Florida. So Corey ended up being the one to foot the bill for Grant's time in this recovery center, which ended up costing him about $15,000 for the 60-day program that Grant was supposed to, complete. Grant's parents and Cody all rode with Grant to the recovery center, and sadly, this would be the last time that Jason, Grant's oldest brother, would see a lot of his immediate family members alive. This program was supposed to be a 60-day program, but after only 12 days, Grant was back at home. Grant had severely downplayed the things that he had done in order to see and chat with Sylvie, and because he wasn't truthful about how essentially his entire world revolved around being able to buy tokens to see and chat with Sylvie, the rehab center just kind of assumed that Grant had hit a little bit of a hard spot and that he would be able to pull himself out of it over time. But things were supposed to be different this time because Grant's dad, Chad, had made a strict list of rules and boundaries that Grant was not to cross. If he was going to be home, he was going to follow these rules. And it seems like what Chad had done was written down options for Grant to choose from before he was actually released from this program. Like, for instance, his living arrangements, Grant had the option to either live at home with his parents, to live on his own, or to join some branch of the military. Grant obviously chose to live at home with his parents. And while his parents were open to letting Grant continue to live with them, it was understood and even written down by Chad that if Grant moved back into his parents' house, that his parents would not be the ones responsible for paying any of Grant's current, existing, or even old debts to anyone for anything. Grant was now going to be responsible for paying his own debts, and this would include the money that Grant had stolen from everybody around him. A few other rules that Grant was expected to follow if he wanted to live at home with his parents were that Grant wouldn't be allowed to stay up all night playing video games, and that Grant wouldn't have access to the internet after midnight. Another thing that Grant's parents implemented was that they would disconnect Grant's old phone and then set him up with a new phone that didn't have access to the internet. His parents even decided that they were going to have their internet provider come in and put a new modem that would have its own certain restrictions in the house for their internet. Now, along with these rules, Grant's parents, Chad and Margaret, also listed the basics, like the fact that Grant needed to get a job and he needed to start figuring out how to pay back all of these debts that he had accumulated. Grant was also supposed to be apologizing to everyone in his family and friend group that he had hurt or stolen from, but the real kicker, was that Chad and Margaret had also reached out to Sylvie while Grant had been in this rehab program. Chad and Margaret reached out to Sylvie to let her know that Grant wasn't this successful, wealthy guy, and they also let her know that a lot of what Grant had told her about himself was a lie. They also asked Sylvie not to keep in touch with Grant. They just asked that she cut off all communication with him, period. And I'm sure Sylvie was just like, what in the hell does this have anything to do with me and my business? But it seems like while Grant's dad, Chad, was pretty strict and he wanted Grant to live up to these rules and expectations that they had laid out for him, Grant's mom, Margaret, on the other hand, she was much more laxed about the whole situation. Because while Grant didn't have access to the internet on his phone or at home on any of the family computers, Margaret was sneaking and letting Grant use her phone to reach out to Sylvie on Twitter. So, from my understanding, Grant's dad, Chad, was really good with computers, and while Grant had been away at this rehab program, Chad had been able to hack into Grant's computer and delete a lot of the things that he had found that were related to Sylvie. And then he had even set up a password on Grant's computer that Grant didn't have. So Grant wouldn't even be able to use his own computer for anything even after he was released from this program. But Margaret was letting Grant use her phone to keep in touch with Sylvie on Twitter. And Grant even later says that his mom would tell him to, watch what he said when he was typing so that, Chad wouldn't come across it and find out. So Margaret was kind of helping Grant to keep in touch with Sylvie, who was Grant's whole addiction. And again, I know this is coming from a place of love, but it's just not healthy. And eventually, Chad would find out that Grant had still been in contact with Sylvie, and the two got into another pretty explosive argument. This time, though, when Chad kicked Grant out of their house, he told Grant that if he ever stepped foot back onto their property again, that he'd kill him. And this is where we're going to pick up next week, because it just gets so much crazier than this. But as for right now, it is time for my crotch goblins to get out of school. I love you so much. Let's do it again. Same time, same place next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.